In 1721, a Boston minister named Cotton Mather saved hundreds of lives by forcing the city to accept a medical procedure so controversial that someone threw a bomb through his window. The note tied to it read, "I will inoculate you with this." That minister had learned the technique from an enslaved man named Onesimus, a fact that Boston's newspapers buried, that its doctors raged against, and that history spent 2 centuries trying to forget. The idea that an African man had handed Boston the key to surviving a smallpox epidemic was too inconvenient for the city's self-image. But he had. And because he did, thousands of people lived who might otherwise have died. That is the kind of city Boston was in the 1700s. Brilliant, frightened, proud, and quietly dependent on the knowledge of people it refused to credit. The room is cold. Not the cold of an open window, but the deeper cold that has settled into the walls over the course of a long night, the kind that doesn't lift until well after noon. You can feel it in the floorboards beneath your feet, in the wool blanket still pulled to your chin, in the way your breath rises in a pale cloud and vanishes against the low ceiling. Outside, the harbour is already awake. You can hear it before you can see it. The creak of timber against timber, the distant call of a dock worker whose voice carries clean and sharp in the February air. The slow sound of water against the wharves. Boston in the 1700s rises early, because Boston has always had business to attend to, and the business begins at the water. The fire in the keeping room hearth has burned down to coals overnight. Someone, perhaps the eldest daughter, perhaps you, will need to stoke it before the household stirs properly. The smell of yesterday's cooking still clings to the air. The ghost of salt pork, of cornmeal, of the herb broth that sat on the crane all afternoon. These smells are not unpleasant. They are the smell of the house itself, inseparable from the plaster and the smoke-darkened beams. This is Boston in the early 1700s. The city is approximately 10,000 souls packed onto a small peninsula that juts into a harbour so well sheltered and deep that ships from London, from the Azores, from the Caribbean slide in and tie up within walking distance of the counting houses and the churches and the candlelit parlours where men argue about trade and theology in the same breath. You live here. You are one of those souls. And today, a morning like any other, an ordinary day in an extraordinary city, is just beginning. The city on the peninsula. To understand what it meant to live in Boston in the early 18th century, you have to first understand what Boston was, and what it believed itself to be. This was a city that had been founded by people who thought God was watching them specifically. The Puritan settlers who arrived in 1630 built their town with the certainty that they were engaged in a divine experiment, a city upon a hill whose success or failure would be observed not only by England but by heaven itself. That founding conviction had faded somewhat by the 1700s, worn smooth by commerce and prosperity, and the inevitable complications of 3 generations of ordinary human life. But it had not disappeared entirely. It had merely gone underground, where it continued to shape the city's character in ways that even the Bostonians themselves didn't always recognise. The peninsula that Boston occupies is small, perhaps 1.5 miles long, no more than half a mile across at its widest point. It is connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of land called the Neck, which floods at high tide and becomes treacherous in winter, so that for all practical purposes Boston functions as an island. The harbour wraps around its eastern and southern shores. The hills that once made it distinctive, Beacon Hill, Copp's Hill, Fort Hill, still rise above the roof lines, though 100 years of building have reduced their wildness. The city smells of the sea, always and everywhere. Salt and fish and tarred rope and the particular brackish smell of tidal mud that no amount of civic improvement ever quite eliminates. By the early 1700s, Boston is the largest city in British North America, though it will not hold that title much longer. Philadelphia is growing quickly, New York is finding its stride, but for now Boston is preeminent. The centre of New England trade, the home of Harvard College, founded 1636, a fact Bostonians mention often, and the seat of the Massachusetts Bay Colony's government, such as it is. The relationship with the Crown is complicated, as it has always been. Boston has more autonomy than most colonial cities and guards it jealously. It also has more opinions, more printing presses, more coffee houses per capita, and more ministers who believe that public life and religious life are inseparable. The population is roughly 10,000, and it is not homogeneous, though the city tends to describe itself as though it were. There are English settlers of 3 and 4 generations, who think of themselves as Bostonians first and Englishmen second. There are more recent arrivals from Scotland and Ireland, who cluster in certain trades and certain neighbourhoods, and are viewed with varying degrees of welcome. There is a small but significant population of free black residents, and a larger population of enslaved people, who appear in account books and church records and newspaper advertisements, and who are woven into the life of the city so thoroughly that their absence from its official self-portrait is a kind of ongoing editorial decision. There are sailors from a dozen nations who pass through the port and sometimes stay. There are indigenous people from the surrounding territories, whose presence in the city's markets and on its wharves is largely undocumented. The economy of Boston runs on trade. Everything comes through the harbour and everything goes out through it. Codfish from the Grand Banks goes to Spain and Portugal and the Caribbean. Lumber and barrel staves go south to the Sugar Islands. Rum, Boston produces a great deal of rum, goes wherever rum is wanted, which is nearly everywhere. In return, Boston receives sugar, molasses, cloth, iron goods, books, wine, spices, and the 1,000 small articles of civilized life that the colony cannot yet manufacture for itself. The merchants who manage this trade are the closest thing Boston has to an aristocracy, and they live accordingly, in handsome houses with polished furniture and silver on the sideboard and servants who move quietly through the rooms. But most Bostonians are not merchants. Most are tradespeople. Coopers and cordwainers and tailors and blacksmiths and bakers and the dozens of other skilled workers that any functioning city requires. They live in narrower houses, on narrower streets, and their prosperity is more precarious. A bad winter, a fire, an epidemic, a disruption in trade. Any of these can undo a craftsman's household in ways that a merchant's household can absorb and survive. This precariousness is not unique to Boston, but it is felt keenly here, in a city that takes pride in its orderliness and its industry, and its God-given destiny, and is therefore somewhat at a loss when things go wrong. The streets of Boston are not orderly. They follow the original paths of cattle, and the contours of a landscape that was never surveyed with a grid in mind. They twist and narrow and occasionally dead-end against a fence or a wharf, or the back wall of a building that went up 30 years ago, without much thought to what might come after. The names of the streets carry the history of the city in compressed form. King Street, where the royal officials have their offices. Milk Street, where the dairy farmers once brought their goods in. Ship Street, which leads where you would expect, and dozens of alleys and lanes whose names have shifted with their populations and their fortunes. Navigating Boston is an act of local knowledge. Strangers get lost. The calendar that governs Boston's year is a mixture of the religious and the practical. The Puritan tradition that founded the city disapproved of Christmas celebrations. They smacked of popery and excess, and several early generations of Bostonians went to work on December 25th the same as any other day. By the 1700s, this strictness has relaxed somewhat, though Christmas is still nothing like the elaborate event it will become in the Victorian era. The holidays that truly matter to Boston are the days of public fast and Thanksgiving proclaimed by the governor, the lecture days when the ministers preach their weekly sermons, and the training days when the militia drills on the common, which are more social occasions than military ones and involve considerable amounts of rum. What do Bostonians worry about? The same things that people in small, dense, commercially dependent cities have always worried about. Fire, epidemic, the price of firewood, the reliability of the currency. The colonial paper money is perpetually suspect, and sensible people try to settle important transactions in silver. They worry about their children and their souls in roughly equal measure. They worry about the weather because the weather in New England is genuinely threatening. The winters are harder than anything most of their ancestors knew in England, and a severe winter can mean frozen harbours and empty larders, and people dying of cold in houses that were not built for this kind of cold. And beneath all of it, always they worry about what God makes of them, whether this experiment is proceeding according to plan, whether the afflictions that visit them are punishment or test, and whether Boston will in the end turn out to be the city upon a hill that its founders imagined, or something more ordinary and more mortal. It is into this city, on an ordinary morning in the early 1700s, that you have woken. The coals need tending, the harbour is already busy, the day has its demands, and they are waiting. Before the light comes fully, you do not wake to an alarm. The concept doesn't exist yet and wouldn't suit Boston's mornings in any case. What wakes you is the particular quality of the darkness, the way it begins to thin, almost imperceptibly, somewhere behind the shuttered window, so that the room you've slept in all your life begins to resolve itself out of blackness into the familiar shapes of furniture and wall, the bed frame, the chest at the foot of the bed, the hook on the back of the door where your outer garments hang, already waiting. It is cold. Not dangerously cold. The fire in the keeping room has been banked against the night and still breathes faintly through the walls, but cold enough that the air outside the blankets carries a sharp edge, and you're in no hurry to meet it. You lie still for a moment, feeling the warmth of the wool against your chin, listening to the sounds of the household and the street beginning to assert themselves around you. There is something settling about those sounds. The heavy breath of your husband or wife beside you still sleeping, the creak of the house itself, the old timber adjusting to the night cold in its characteristic way, a sound you've heard so many thousands of times that you would notice its absence before you notice its presence. And from outside, already, the sounds of a city that doesn't sleep much past 4 in the morning. A cartwheel on the cobblestones of the street below, a voice calling out to someone across the lane, the distant bell of the Old South meeting house marking the quarter hour. You rise, the feet find the floor, bare boards cold enough to sting briefly, and you move by memory through the dimness to where your stockings are, and then your shoes, and then the wool petticoat or the heavy breeches, whichever your life requires. Dressing in the morning dark of a Boston winter is not a leisurely activity. It is purposeful and quick. The warmth of the bed retreats behind you as you move, and you are already thinking about the fire. The fire is the first business of every morning. Without it, the household cannot function, cannot cook, cannot heat water, cannot keep the youngest children from shivering in their beds. Tending it is usually the work of the person who rises first, which in most households means the wife, or the eldest daughter, or the servant if the family is prosperous enough to employ one. You carry yesterday's coals forward with a small iron shovel, coaxing them from near death with careful breath, and a handful of kindling kept dry by the hearth. The kindling catches. The larger sticks begin to glow. The fire, which has been waiting patiently through the night for this attention, begins to speak again, a low, steady crackle that is one of the most reassuring sounds in the world. The keeping room, what later centuries will call the kitchen, though that word is not quite right for this era, is the heart of the house. It is the largest room with the largest hearth, and in winter it is the warmest room by a considerable margin. The hearth itself is wide enough to stand in. There are hooks and cranes for hanging pots, a bread oven built into the side of the chimney that holds heat for hours after the baking is done, and a trivet and a collection of long-handled tools, the toasting fork, the waffle iron, the flesh fork with its 2 curved tine hanging on the wall beside it. The floor is swept stone, cold underfoot, with a braided rag rug placed before the hearth that will, over the course of the morning, become the most comfortable spot in the house. Water is the next thing you need. In a city, water does not come from a well in the yard, or rather, it might, but the wells of Boston are of varying quality and reputation, and some households prefer to buy water from the water carriers who move through the streets in the mornings with their yokes and barrels. The price is modest, a few pence per barrel, and the water from the springs north of the city is reliably clean and cold. You have kept a bucket filled the night before, covered with a wooden lid, and now you pour some into the great iron pot and swing it over the fire. This is the rhythm of a Boston morning. The small, purposeful actions that build a habitable day out of the raw material of darkness and cold. You move through them without much conscious thought, because you have moved through them thousands of times, and they have become part of your body's understanding of how a morning proceeds. The fire builds, the water heats, the light very slowly begins to gather itself at the edges of the shutters. When the water is warm enough, not boiling, just warm, you pour a small amount into a basin and wash your face and hands. This is less elaborate than later centuries will make it. There is no dedicated bathroom, no piped water, no mirror large enough to see yourself clearly in. The wash is practical. Face, hands, the back of the neck. If you have the means, you might use a small piece of imported soap, which smells faintly of tallow, and whatever herbs the soap maker used to improve it. More likely, you use plain water. The basin is earthenware, heavy, with a faint crack on one side that has been there for 2 years and doesn't seem to be getting worse. The children begin to stir. You can hear them above, the thump of feet hitting the floor, the low murmur of siblings negotiating the morning. The eldest will dress herself and help the younger ones. The youngest will need more assistance. By the time they appear at the top of the stairs, faces still soft with sleep, you should have the porridge pot on and the fire fully established, so that the cold they encounter on the way down is at least mitigated by the warmth rising from below. The light outside is growing. It is still grey. In February in Boston, the grey lasts until well past 6. But it is distinguishable now from darkness, which makes a difference to the quality of the morning. You open the shutters. The street below is already populated. A woman carrying a basket toward the market. A man in a heavy coat heading down toward the wharves. A cart piled with barrels of saltfish making its slow way over the uneven cobblestones. Everyone moves with the particular purposefulness of cold weather mornings, heads slightly down, steps a little quicker than comfort requires. Across the lane, your neighbour's chimney is already smoking. Good. It means they are up and at it too, and the slight communal anxiety of winter mornings, is everyone all right, did anyone suffer in the night, is alleviated by the simple evidence of smoke. In a city this dense, where houses press close against each other and everyone's business is more or less visible to everyone else, there is a kind of low-level social monitoring that happens without anyone deciding to do it. You note the smoke. You note that the Widow Hayward's shutter is still closed. You note the sound of the blacksmith's hammer already going 3 streets over, and feel the particular satisfaction of a city that is, as of this moment, intact and operational. The porridge bubbles. The fire has settled into its working rhythm. Not the frantic heat of the first half hour, but the steady, dependable warmth of established coals. The children are downstairs now, arranged near the hearth. The smallest pressed against your side with a wool blanket still around her shoulders. Your husband or wife has risen and dressed and gone to whatever the first task of the morning requires. The shed, the shop, the counting room, the barn if you're one of the households that keeps a cow or a pig in the small yard behind the house. You stir the porridge. It is cornmeal, the Indian meal that New England has adopted as its staple grain because corn grows here reliably and wheat does not, or not in the quantities a city of 10,000 requires. The porridge is thick and pale and smells of nothing much on its own, but that is what the molasses is for. The dark, thick sweetness that comes in barrels from the Caribbean sugar islands, and is one of Boston's great imports and one of its great pleasures. A spoonful of molasses stirred into a bowl of cornmeal porridge is not a sophisticated breakfast. But it is warm and filling and sweet, and on a cold February morning in a Boston kitchen, it is exactly what is needed. The almanac on the shelf by the door has a word or two to say about the weather today, and about the state of the moon, and about the agricultural and domestic tasks appropriate to the current fortnight. The almanac is one of the most read documents in any Boston household, read more consistently than the Bible, though no one says so. The almanac for the year is purchased in the autumn from the bookseller on Cornhill Street, and consulted morning by morning through the year. Is today a good day for bloodletting, for planting if you are a farmer, for long journeys, for baking? The instructions are not entirely scientific, but they impose a reassuring order on the calendar, and in a life governed by the variability of weather and the body and the market, an imposed order is not worthless. You go to the window. The glass is old and wavy. The best glass comes from England and is expensive, and what most Boston houses have is adequate rather than excellent. And the view through it is slightly distorted, the street beyond rendered in soft curves, the figures of the passers-by moving through the imperfect lens of the colonial pane. But you can see the sky, and the sky tells you something that the almanac does not. It is going to stay cold today. The cloud cover is thick and low and uniform, a particular shade of grey that promises neither snow nor clearing, just the sustained cold of a winter day in a harbour city that is too far north for comfort and too attached to its situation to consider moving. There is satisfaction in the morning even so. It is an underrated thing, the satisfaction of an ordinary morning going correctly. The fire caught and holding, the porridge thickened and ready, the children fed and not fighting more than usual, the day ahead shaped and known. It is not the satisfaction of achievement or surprise, it is quieter than that, more like the satisfaction of a thing that fits, the morning fitting the shape of a morning, the household fitting the shape of a household, the day beginning in the way that days begin in this house, in this city, in this winter. The morning moves forward, The day begins to declare itself. The light strengthens outside the windows, losing its grey quality and becoming something more like the thin, clear light of a winter morning in a harbour city. The fire crackles, the children eat, and you stand at the hearth with the long-handled spoon in your hand, watching the steam rise from the pot, feeling the warmth spread from your front across the room, thinking about the day ahead, what it requires, what it promises, and what, if the weather holds and the fire doesn't go out, and the bread rises and nothing breaks or runs out or goes wrong in the particular ways that things go wrong in this city, on this peninsula, in this cold and particular winter, it might allow. What the pot holds food in colonial Boston is not a simple subject, and it is not a single story. There is the food of the merchant's household, where the sideboard holds imported sugars and English biscuits, and the dinner table is set with pewter that catches the candlelight, and a roast that smells of the herbs brought in from the kitchen garden last summer, and dried in bundles over the hearth. And then there is the food of the craftsman's household, and the sailor's boarding house, and the widow's single rented room. Simpler, more repetitive, but not without its pleasures, and not without the kind of specific seasonal richness that comes from knowing what grows here and what keeps and what the harbour brings in. You're somewhere in the middle of that range, most likely. Most Bostonians are. And what you eat across the span of a day is governed by three forces: what is available in the market, what the season permits, and what the fire will cook. The morning porridge is behind you now. The bowls have been wiped clean, not washed, not in the elaborate sense of later centuries, but wiped with a cloth and set back on the shelf for dinner. Water is a resource that requires effort to obtain and effort to heat, and it is not spent casually on washing dishes that will be used again in a few hours. The kitchen cloth is heavy with use. It smells of porridge and smoke and the residue of yesterday's pork fat, and it performs its function adequately, and that is enough. The bread is what you are thinking about now. Boston is a bread-eating city, as all English cities are. The idea of a meal without bread is nearly inconceivable, and the bread oven set into the chimney breast is used several times a week, more in winter when there is nothing else to do, and the oven's heat is welcome rather than burdensome. The dough you mixed last night, wheat flour if you can afford it, a mixture of wheat and rye if you cannot, has been rising on the hearth shelf since before you went to bed. You go to check it now, pressing the dough gently with one floured finger. It springs back slowly. It is ready, or close enough. The loaves are shaped and set to prove one more time while the oven heats. You build the fire in the bread oven separately from the hearth fire, a small hot fire of dry hardwood that burns fast and gives up its heat to the stone walls of the oven chamber. When the fire has burned down and the coals are raked out, you test the heat by holding your arm inside. If you can keep it there for the count of 20, the oven is the right temperature. This test has no name and requires no instrument. It is simply something you know how to do. The way you know how to judge whether the salt pork has salted long enough by pressing it with your thumb, or whether the fire needs more wood by the quality of its sound. The loaves go in, the oven door, a heavy wooden plug faced with iron, goes in after them, and now you wait. The smell of baking bread begins to come from the oven almost immediately, a smell so fundamental to the idea of a home in any era that it barely needs description. It is warm and yeasty and slightly sweet, with a faint note of wood smoke from the oven walls. It is the smell of time passing in the most comfortable possible way. While the bread bakes, there is dinner to begin thinking about. Dinner in colonial Boston is the midday meal, the main meal of the day, and supper is the lighter meal in the evening. This is the opposite of what later centuries will do, and the logic of it is clear. The middle of the day is when the fire is hottest, and the household is most active, and a large meal then sustains the afternoon's work in a way that a large evening meal, eaten as the energy of the day is failing, does not. For dinner today, you have salt pork. Almost certainly salt pork. This is the staple meat of Boston households. Pork legs and shoulders and sides packed in barrels of salt brine and kept in the cellar, where the cold of the ground preserves them through the winter months. The salt draws the moisture from the meat and prevents spoilage, but it also draws the flavour, which is why salt pork must be soaked before cooking, left overnight in a pot of cold water, or for at least several hours if you forgot to do it the night before, which happens. You cut a piece from the barrel, not a small piece because there are 5 of you plus the apprentice who sleeps above the shop, and set it to soak in a pot of fresh water. It will go into the great iron pot later in the morning with dried beans and whatever root vegetables came in from the cellar. Turnips, probably, and the last of the autumn onions beginning to soften and sprout but still serviceable. The beans were soaked overnight. The pot will hang over the fire for the better part of 3 hours. When it is done, the meat will fall apart in soft, pale threads, and the broth will have thickened with the starch from the beans, and the whole thing will smell of pork and onion, and the particular richness of things that have cooked long and slow. This is called bean porridge, or bean soup, or sometimes simply the pot, a dish so standard in New England that it appears in household accounts and letters and even poetry without much further description. It is not exciting. It is not meant to be exciting. It is meant to be warming and filling and reliable, and it is all of these things, and in a city that is cold for half the year and where the cost of food is a genuine daily concern for most households, reliability and warmth are not small virtues. Fish appears regularly on the Boston table, and with good reason. The Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland produce some of the finest cod in the world, and Boston is one of the primary ports through which that cod flows, some of it fresh in summer, most of it salted and dried for keeping. Dried salt cod, soaked and then boiled or baked, is a Friday dish for many households, and a weekday dish for others, and appears in various forms throughout the week. Cod chowder, which is made with salt pork fried out for its fat, then onion, then the fish, then milk or cream if there is cream to spare, thickened with a handful of ship's biscuit broken into pieces, is one of the city's most characteristic dishes. It is thick and savoury and tastes, in some indefinable way, of the harbour. Corn appears in almost everything. New England adopted maize from the indigenous peoples of the region within the first generation of settlement, and it has never let go of it. Cornmeal goes into porridge and johnny cake, which is fried on a griddle and eaten with butter and molasses and is better than it sounds. Corn is boiled whole in summer and dried and stored in autumn. Popped corn, kernels shaken in a long-handled iron basket over the coals, is an evening treat, an entertainment that never quite loses its appeal, no matter how many times you have seen the kernels burst and multiply. The bread comes out of the oven. You can hear it before you see the oven door moved, the sound of the crust settling, a faint crackling that means the outside has firmed and browned. You slide the loaves out onto the wooden breadboard, 3 of them, round and dense and fragrant, and tap the bottom of each one with your knuckle. The hollow sound they make tells you they are done. You set them upright to cool, and the whole keeping room fills with the smell of them, and for a few minutes the ordinary morning acquires a quality of abundance that is not quite luxury but is not far from it. There are sweets, though they are simpler than what later centuries will produce. Molasses is the great sweetener of colonial New England, cheaper than cane sugar, more robust in flavour, dark and mineral sweet in a way that white sugar cannot quite replicate. Molasses goes into the bean porridge at the end, a spoonful that rounds the savouriness with something deeper. It goes into gingerbread, which is baked in the bread oven in the days after the bread and is firm and spiced with ginger and cinnamon, and sometimes a little pepper, and is eaten in small pieces because it is rich, and a little goes a long way. Molasses goes into flip, which is a tavern drink, dark beer and rum sweetened with molasses, and heated with a red-hot iron plunged into the mug. But that is an evening consideration. Eating in colonial Boston is inseparable from the rhythms of preservation and season. In summer there is fresh milk and vegetables from the garden, fresh fish from the harbour, early corn on the cob, strawberries and blueberries from the fields north of the city. In winter you eat what was put by in autumn, the salted meats, the dried beans, the root vegetables in the cellar, the dried fish, the preserved fruits, the grain in the sack by the hearth. The cupboard is not bare in winter, far from it in a prosperous household, but it is limited in a way that summer is not, and the cook works within those limits with the particular ingenuity of someone who has been doing this all her life. By mid-morning the pot is on and the bread is cooling and the smell of the salt pork and beans has begun to permeate the house in the way that long-cooked food always does, warmly, gradually, in a way that makes the rooms feel inhabited and warm even when the fire has settled to its quieter working state. The children who are old enough are at their tasks. The apprentice has come in from the shop to warm his hands at the fire and been sent back out with a piece of bread. The morning is advancing and the pot is doing what the pot always does, slowly, without hurry, toward noon. If you're drifting off, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you wake up. Sleep well. The labour of the hands. Most of Boston works with its hands. This is the fundamental fact of life in the early 18th century that no amount of counting-house prosperity or ministerial learning can disguise. The city runs on physical labour, and the people who perform it outnumber the people who direct it by perhaps 10 to 1. The merchant who sends ships to the Caribbean is dependent every day on the coopers who make the barrels, the rope makers who make the rigging, the caulkers who keep the hulls watertight, the dockhands who load and unload the cargo, and the dozens of other skilled and semi-skilled workers whose hands do the actual work of trade. Boston knows this, though it doesn't always say so. The trades of Boston are organised along the Old English lines of master, journeyman and apprentice. The master owns the shop and the tools and the customer relationships and takes the profit. The journeyman is a skilled worker who has completed his apprenticeship and is paid by the day or the week. The word comes from the French journée, meaning a day's work, and who may eventually become a master himself, or may not, depending on capital and luck and the saturation of the market in his particular trade. The apprentice is the youngest link in this chain, usually a boy of 10 to 14 years old, bound by legal contract to his master for a term of several years in exchange for room, board, clothing and instruction in the trade. If you are a craftsman, your day follows the light. Work begins at first light and ends when the light fails, with a break for dinner at midday. In summer, this means very long days, 14 or 15 hours of useful light, and in winter, much shorter ones, which Boston craftsmen make up for as best they can with tallow candles and whale oil lamps, neither of which is cheap. The cost of artificial light is a genuine consideration in the craft economy. You don't leave candles burning in an empty room. You work by the window as long as the light holds, and you move the work closer to the candle as it fails. The sounds of a working Boston morning come from every direction at once. The blacksmith is the loudest. The hammer on the anvil carries 3 streets in any weather, a rhythmic ringing that punctuates the morning like a slow clock. The carpenter's plane makes a quieter sound, a sustained hiss with a pause at the end as the shaving curls to the floor. The shoemaker's hammer is different from the blacksmith's, shorter, lighter, more rapid, tapping out a quick, intricate rhythm on the last. From the Ropewalks north of the city comes the low hum of the twisting machinery, and the particular sweet tarry smell of hemp, and the sight of men walking slowly backward down a 300-foot lane as the rope forms behind them. The wharves begin their business very early. The ships tied along Long Wharf, which extends 500 feet into the harbour, the longest wharf in North America and a source of considerable Boston pride, begin receiving and discharging cargo with the tide, because the harbour's tidal range is significant, and the depth at the wharf face changes by several feet between high and low water. The dockhands who do this work are not apprentices learning a trade. They are men who work for daily wages, and whose employment depends on which ships are in and what they carry. On a busy day in spring or summer, the wharves are almost impossibly crowded, the barrels and bales stacked head high, the carts threading through, the merchants' clerks checking invoices against the tallies chalked on boards, the sailors from a dozen nations speaking among themselves in languages that blur and overlap. In winter, the pace at the wharves is slower. Some ships are laid up for the season, their rigging taken down and stored. The harbour itself rarely freezes. It is too deep and too salt for that, though the shallow coves sometimes ice over in a hard winter. But the weather makes loading and unloading an uncomfortable business, and the pace reflects this. Men work with gloves on, which slows everything, and take their warming breaks more frequently, crowding into the waterfront taverns for a mug of flip or a cup of hot cider before going back out to the cold. The merchants conduct their business in a different register entirely. Their offices, called counting rooms because counting money is the central activity, are small, heated rooms above the warehouse or in the front of the house, furnished with a high writing desk, a stool, several ledger books, and often a portrait of the merchant's father or grandfather, looking prosperous and assured. Here the deals are struck and the letters of credit written, and the complex arithmetic of transatlantic trade performed. A Boston merchant in the early 1700s is managing correspondence with partners in London, in Barbados, in the Azores, in Philadelphia, keeping track of ships at sea whose positions he cannot know for certain and whose fates he cannot control, extending credit on the strength of reputation and the hope that the ship will arrive safely and the market in Lisbon will hold. Women work too, though their work is less visible in the official record and sometimes entirely absent from it. There are women who run taverns and inns, often as widows carrying on a husband's business, and who do so with considerable competence. There are women who take in laundry or sewing, who sell eggs or butter from their domestic production, who assist in a husband's shop in ways that the account books don't record because the money goes into the same household. There are midwives, women who attend births, which are frequent, and deaths, which are also frequent, and who carry between the households of Boston a kind of medical knowledge that is informal and unlicensed and often more effective than the physician's alternatives. The apprentice boys move through the city like a separate class of small citizens. You see them everywhere, running errands for their masters, carrying tools, sweeping shavings from workshops, delivering finished goods to customers. They are not quite children and not quite workers, occupying a middle space that is sometimes difficult and sometimes simply tiring. The terms of an apprenticeship are specific. The master agrees to teach the trade, to provide adequate food and clothing, and to give the boy some basic literacy if he doesn't already have it. In return, the boy agrees to serve faithfully, to keep the master's secrets, not to marry or gamble or frequent alehouses without permission. The contract is legal and enforceable. Most apprenticeships work out adequately. Some are genuinely good. A master who takes pride in teaching, a boy who is talented and grateful. A few are miserable, and the misery is contained within the legal structure of the indenture until the term is up. There is a particular pleasure in skilled handwork that is difficult to articulate but real, and Boston's craftsmen are not unaware of it. The cordwainer who has just finished a pair of shoes, good shoes, well lasted, with a sole that will wear for years and an upper that fits the customer's foot exactly, holds them up in the late afternoon light and sees in them something complete. The cabinet maker who has cut a dovetail joint so precise that the two pieces of wood move together with a whisper and hold without a nail experiences a satisfaction that doesn't require anyone else to observe it. The blacksmith who has drawn out a hinge from a bar of iron, heating and hammering and quenching in the sequence that his apprenticeship taught him, produces something that is both useful and beautiful in the way that purely useful things sometimes are, and is not entirely unconscious of this. The workday winds toward noon. The light has reached its highest point, thin, winter white, coming in the north-facing shop window at a low angle that picks out the dust in the air and the fine curls of wood shaving on the floor. Dinner is approaching. The fire at the hearth in the back room has been tended by whoever's turn it was this morning, and the pot that was set on before the work began is producing a smell that the body responds to before the mind quite catches up. Warmth, salt, something rich and ready. The tools are set down. The work is left where it is. The apron comes off and hangs on its nail. For an hour or a little more the city will pause in its labour, not all at once, and not entirely because the harbour doesn't pause, and the fire in the bakehouse doesn't pause, and the baby that was born this morning in the house on Milk Street doesn't pause. But in the workshops and the counting rooms and the carpenters' yards, there is a general slowing, a drawing in toward the hearth and the table, that constitutes the midday rest. You wash your hands at the basin. The water is cold. The soap, if you use it, is a small brown cake that smells of tallow and lye, and does the job without ceremony. The hands dry on the cloth by the door. And then you turn toward the keeping room, and the smell of the pot, and the faces of your children already seated and waiting, and the particular ordinariness of the noon meal, which is the same today as it was yesterday and will be again tomorrow, and which is, in its repetition and its warmth, one of the steadier comforts of a working life. The Ropewalks north of the city deserve particular mention, because they are among the most distinctive features of Boston's industrial landscape, and because the work done in them is as skilled and as specific as any work in the city, though it is rarely credited as such. A rope walk is a long, narrow building, the length determined by the length of rope that can be made in a single continuous operation, which is to say several hundred feet, in which men walk slowly backward down the length of the building, feeding fibre into a spinning mechanism that twists it into yarn, and then into strand, and then into rope. The smell of a rope walk is distinctive. The raw hemp has a green, slightly rank quality. The tarring process adds a sharp chemical note, and the warm air of the building mixes these with the particular smell of working men and sawdust from the floor, in a combination that anyone who has spent time in a rope walk carries in memory long after they have left it. Boston's maritime industry cannot function without rope, and rope cannot be made without the rope walk workers, whose skill and stamina are considerable. The printing trades are growing in the early 1700s. The establishment of the Boston newsletter in 1704 has created a demand for printing that is new in scale if not in kind, and the printers who set type and operate the press and manage the ink and paper that the process requires are among the more technically sophisticated tradespeople in the city. The press itself is a large wooden mechanism, not much changed in its fundamentals from the designs of the previous century, which requires considerable physical strength to operate. The pressman leans his full weight against the long lever with each impression, producing a single printed page before resetting and doing it again, page after page, for as many hours as the light and the commission require. Printing is slow, it is skilled, and the text that comes off the press, whether it's a sermon or an almanac or the weekly news sheet, represents a small act of preservation, the fixing of words into something that can outlast the person who wrote them. The afternoon will bring more of the same, more of the hammer or the needle or the pen or the broom or whatever tool defines your particular contribution to the city's ongoing project of sustaining itself. But that is the afternoon's problem. For now there is dinner and the fire and the brief rest that every working body in Boston is taking at roughly this same hour, in roughly this same way, with roughly this same mixture of tiredness and hunger, and the low, reliable satisfaction of work that has been done and will, tomorrow, be done again. Inside the walls, a Boston house of the early 1700s is a compact thing. The land on the peninsula is not unlimited, and the city has been building on it for 70 years by the time you live here, so the houses press against each other on lots that would strike later generations as extremely narrow. The typical craftsman's house is perhaps 20 feet wide and 30 feet deep, 2 stories with a steep-pitched roof and a central chimney stack around which the rooms are arranged like planets around a sun. The chimney is the axis of the house. Everything relates to it. The ground floor holds the keeping room, the main living and cooking space, and perhaps a parlour, if the family is of sufficient standing to maintain one. The parlour is the public room, the room where guests are received and business is occasionally conducted, and where on Sundays the family sits in its best clothes and observes the Sabbath with whatever mixture of piety and restlessness the children can manage. The parlour has the better furniture. It has the looking-glass if there is one, small and slightly wavy in the way that 18th century glass tends to be, but expensive enough to be a possession worth noting in an estate inventory. It has the Bible on the table, and perhaps a few other books, an almanac, a collection of sermons, a book of practical instruction in some matter related to the family's trade. The keeping room is where the real life of the house happens. Its floor is bare boards or flagstone, easier to sweep than the parlour's occasional rug. The ceiling is low, 6 feet, sometimes less, and crossed with heavy beams that you learn to duck in the first week and never quite stop being aware of in the decades after. The beams are blackened with years of smoke, because even with the chimney drawing well, there is always some smoke in the room, some residue of the fire that doesn't quite make it all the way up and out. The smell of it is embedded in the house itself, in the plaster walls, in the ceiling boards, in the wool of every garment hung here for any length of time. A colonial house smells of smoke the way a ship smells of salt, not as an accident or an inconvenience, but as a fundamental quality of what it is. The hearth is massive by modern standards. In a cold climate with no alternative source of heat, size matters. A larger fire means more warmth, and a larger hearth can accommodate a larger fire. Cooking and heating happen in the same space, which means the cook spends her day within a few feet of a large open fire in a room that in summer can become genuinely oppressive. In winter, however, the fire is everything. It is the source of warmth and light and hot food and hot water, and tending it is a full-time occupation requiring constant attention, adding wood as needed, moving the pots, adjusting the crane, banking the coals at night so the morning start is easier. The furniture is solid and simple. The table is wide and heavy, made of local wood, pine or oak, by a Boston joiner who was probably trained in England and adapted his methods to the available materials. The chairs are rush-seated, the rush woven in a pattern that is standard enough to be invisible until it begins to wear. The bed, there may be 2 if the children sleep separately, is the most expensive piece of furniture in the house, and for good reason. A well-made bed is essential to decent sleep in a climate where winter nights can be genuinely dangerous, and the mattress, the bedstead, and the bedding together represent a significant investment. The mattress is a linen tick stuffed with wool or feathers, or in humbler households dried corn husks or straw. The bolster is a long pillow that runs the full width of the bed. The blankets are heavy wool. The bedstead has curtains, not for decoration, but for insulation, drawn closed at night to trap the warmth of the sleepers inside a small textile tent. Storage is constant preoccupation. There are no closets in the modern sense. Closets are a later invention, reflecting a later relationship with space and possessions. Instead, there are chests, which sit at the foot of beds or along walls and hold clothing and linens and the small valuable objects that don't have another home. There are shelves, built into the wall beside the fireplace where the kitchen equipment lives, the earthenware bowls, the wooden trenchers, the pewter plates that are reserved for company, the iron pots of various sizes, the salt box, the sugar cone under its blue paper wrapper. There are hooks, everywhere, at every height, for hanging things, coats, tools, baskets, dried herbs, onion ropes, the flesh fork, the market basket, the child's small winter cap. Light after dark is one of the persistent concerns of colonial life. The sun sets early in a Boston winter, before 5 in the evening in December, and the household must operate by artificial light for several hours each night, for supper, for the evening's conversation or reading or mending, for putting the children to bed. The sources of that light are limited and expensive. Tallow candles, made from the rendered fat of cattle and sheep, are the most common, and they produce a warm yellowish light that flickers in any draught, and smells faintly of animal fat when the wick needs trimming. Whale oil lamps are cleaner and brighter, but whale oil is more expensive than tallow and is not available in every household. Rushlights, dried rushes dipped in grease and held in an iron clip, are the cheapest option and the least satisfactory, burning quickly and producing a thin, wavering light that is almost worse than darkness. A Boston household of moderate means might use 3 or 4 candles in an evening, placed strategically, one on the kitchen table for the supper preparation, one at the parlour table where the husband is reading or the wife is sewing, one by the stairs to light the children up to bed. Each candle is attended, snuffed to remove the burned portion of the wick that would otherwise smoke and drip, moved to where the light is most needed, protected from drafts that make them gutter and run. The art of managing artificial light without waste is something learned in childhood and practiced without much conscious thought for the rest of a lifetime. The cellar below the house is as important as the rooms above it. This is where the winter's provisions live, the barrels of salt pork and salt fish, the root vegetables in their bins of sand, the crocks of butter and salted eggs, the jars of preserved fruit put up in the autumn, the small barrel of cider that is the household's drinking supply, now that the well is questionable in cold weather. The cellar is cool enough to keep things well, the ground temperature below the frost line is constant, and the house above keeps the space from freezing, and dry enough that the provisions don't moulder as long as the drainage is adequate. You go down there with a candle several times a day, and the smell of it, earth and salt and the faint sweet sour of the cider barrel, is as familiar as any other smell in the house. Heating and firewood are constant considerations. Wood is the only fuel available in quantity, and Boston's supply of it is dependent on the forests of the mainland and the coastal trade that brings it into the city by boat. A good-sized Boston household burns several cords of wood in a winter. A cord is a stack 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, and 8 feet long, and the cost of it varies with the severity of the season and the reliability of the coastal trade. A very cold winter with ice in the harbour can disrupt the wood supply at exactly the moment it's most needed, and the price spikes accordingly, and the households that didn't lay in enough supply in the autumn find themselves paying premium prices or, in the worst cases, cold. The house is alive in ways that later, better insulated houses are not. The wind finds its way through the gaps around the windows and under the door, and the curtains move in it, and the candle flame bends. In a storm the house speaks, the timbers creak, the chimney moans, the shutters rattle against their latches, and you feel, in the bones of the house, the weather that is happening outside. This is not uncomfortable exactly. It is real, in the way that a well-built modern house insulated and sealed against the weather is not quite real. You're never unaware, in a colonial Boston house, of the season outside, or of the fact that the warmth you have is the warmth you have made and must continue to maintain. In the afternoon, the light in the keeping room shifts. It has been coming in from the east since morning, and now it moves toward the south-facing windows, lower and warmer in quality than the sharp morning light. The fire has settled to working coals, the pot has been lifted off and the dinner eaten and the table cleared. Someone, the oldest girl or the wife, or in a household with means the hired girl, is washing the trenchers in a wooden bucket of hot water, scraping the remains into the slops pail that will go to the pig, wiping each piece with the kitchen cloth. The sound of this, the soft scrape and wipe, the drip of water, the creak of the bucket, is one of the sounds of a Boston afternoon in winter, domestic, rhythmic, undemanding. The children are at tasks near the fire. The younger ones are playing with the few toys the house offers: a rag doll, a set of wooden pins for a bowling game, a small carved horse that was a gift from a sea captain uncle, and is the prized possession of the youngest boy. The older children are working, the girl with her mending because the clothes of an active household are always in need of repair, and this work is done in the afternoon light before it fails. The boy with his hornbook going over his letters under the occasional supervision of whoever can be spared to check his progress. The afternoon moves slowly, which is its nature. The urgent energy of the morning, the fire to build, the bread to manage, the pots to set on, has spent itself. What remains is maintenance, keeping the fire from failing, keeping the children occupied, keeping the household in the ordinary running order that allows tomorrow morning's urgency to begin without the complications of today's neglect. This is the unromantic middle of the day, and it is where most of the actual substance of a life in colonial Boston is spent. By late afternoon the light has flattened and greyed, and the first suggestion of evening is in the air, though evening is still an hour away. You add wood to the fire. The room brightens briefly as the new wood catches. The children, sensing the approach of supper and the end of the afternoon's long stretch, become slightly louder, slightly more restless, pressing against the limits of the keeping room with the pent-up energy of bodies that have been indoors most of the day. You manage this in the way you always manage it, with patience that is mostly genuine and occasionally performed, with small redirections and small adjustments, with the knowledge that supper is not far off and the evening is not far after that. What you wear and what it means. Clothing in colonial Boston is not a private matter. It is, quite deliberately and by law as well as custom, a public statement. What you wear tells anyone who sees you on the street roughly where you stand in the social order, your trade, your prosperity, your aspirations, and occasionally your religion. The Puritan founding tradition of the colony had strong opinions about dress. It distrusted excess, distrusted ornament, and distrusted the vanity it believed both to represent. By the early 1700s, the most extreme sumptuary laws, the ones that actually prohibited people below a certain income from wearing lace or silver button, have largely fallen away, but the attitudes behind them have not quite, and clothing is still a negotiated territory between what a person can afford, what their station permits, and what the neighbours will say. A craftsman's wife in Boston in the early 1700s wears roughly this: a linen shift next to the skin, which is the foundational garment, washed most frequently because it absorbs the body's oils and perspiration. Over this, a pair of stays, what later generations will call a corset, though the silhouette it produces is different from the Victorian version, straighter, flatter, supporting the torso rather than dramatically cinching it. The stays are made of heavy linen stiffened with boning, wooden splints or strips of whalebone, which Boston has in good supply, and laced up the back. Over the stays, a wool petticoat, or sometimes two in winter, and over that, the gown, a one-piece dress in dark wool cut simply, with a bodice that pins shut at the front and sleeves that end at the elbow, below which a white linen undersleeve extends to the wrist. On her head, always, something. Bare heads are for sleeping and for close family. In public, indoors and out, a woman's head is covered, usually a white linen cap close to the head, tied under the chin or at the back, sometimes covered by a larger cap or a hat for outdoor wear. The cap is both practical and symbolic. It signals modesty, married status, respectability. A woman who goes out without her cap is making a statement, and it is not a statement that 1700s Boston receives neutrally. A craftsman wears a linen shirt against the skin, longer than a modern shirt and serving some of the functions of underwear, wool breeches that button at the knee, with linen stockings below that either tie or are held up with garters, a waistcoat, the sleeveless or short-sleeved garment worn over the shirt, in wool or occasionally in a better fabric for Sundays. And over all this, in cold weather, a heavy wool coat, cut long, with large pockets at the side seams and buttons down the front that are almost certainly pewter, since silver buttons are for prosperous men, and the tradesman is neither prosperous nor eager to appear to be making claims above his station. On his head, a broad-brimmed felt hat, the standard outdoor headwear for working men, worn in most weathers and taken off in church and in the presence of social superiors. The quantity of clothing in a household is small by later standards. A craftsman's wife might own 3 gowns, one for every day, one for better occasions, one so worn that it has been demoted to household work and will eventually become rags or patchwork. She owns perhaps 4 shifts, washed in rotation. She owns 1 pair of shoes, possibly 2. The stiff square-toed leather shoes that are standard for the period, made by the cordwainer on the next street and resoled every few years until the uppers give out. She owns a wool shawl, a winter cloak, several caps of varying quality, and a pair of leather gloves worn only in the worst weather because leather gloves are expensive and ruined by water and must be treated with care. The shoes deserve some attention because they are a constant preoccupation in Boston streets. The cobblestones, where they exist, are uneven and slippery in rain and ice. The unpaved streets, and most streets outside the main commercial thoroughfares are unpaved, are mud in spring and autumn and frozen ruts in winter, each of which presents its own hazards. Good shoes matter. They matter for warmth. Wet feet in a Boston winter led to chilblains at minimum and pneumonia at worst, and they matter for comfort in a life that involves a great deal of standing and walking. The cordwainer who makes your shoes knows your feet, or the last that approximates them, and a well-made pair of shoes that fits correctly is worth the investment in time and money that a visit to the cordwainer requires. The problem of washing clothes occupies a surprising amount of a colonial household's time and energy. Laundry is not done daily. That would require quantities of hot water and firewood that most households cannot afford to spend on it, but rather weekly, on a designated day that can require the better part of a morning or afternoon, and leaves the house festooned with wet garments steaming by the fire. The linen is washed most frequently, shifts, shirts, caps, stockings, the napkins used at table. The outer garments, the gowns and breeches and coats, are not washed in the modern sense at all. They are brushed, aired, spot-cleaned as needed. But the act of washing wool in hot water with lye soap produces a shrunken, felted result that destroys the garment, so it is not done. Wool is managed differently, brushed and aired, the spots treated with chalk or breadcrumbs or a little gentle scraping, kept as clean as a garment that cannot be properly washed can be kept. The smells of clothing as a result are present, not aggressively, not in a way that period Bostonians would have noticed or remarked on, because everyone's clothing smells the same way, and the norm adjusts accordingly. But there is, in a gathering of bodies in a church or a tavern or a counting room, a warm animal undercurrent of dried perspiration and lanolin and tallow and the various occupational smells, fish and tar from the waterfront workers, sawdust from the carpenters, a faint chemical note from the tanners who work at the north end. That is simply the smell of human beings who are warm and working and doing the best they can with the resources available to them. Fabric is expensive. This is the governing fact of colonial dress. Everything that is woven, wool, linen, silk for those who can afford it, must either be made locally or imported, and either way represents a significant cost. Nothing is wasted. The good gown, when it wears at the elbows and hem, has those portions cut away and replaced, and the good fabric moved to a new context. When the gown is past saving, it becomes a petticoat. When the petticoat is past saving, it becomes patches for the quilts that pile on the beds in winter. When the patches are too small to be useful for anything, they become rags for cleaning, and when the rags are past that, they go to the paper mill. There is a paper mill north of the city that purchases worn linen rags, which are the raw material of colonial paper. Nothing leaves the system until it is genuinely exhausted. Buttons are significant objects. They are individually expensive enough to be itemized in estate inventories, passed down through wills, removed from worn-out garments and kept for the next one. A coat with 24 pewter buttons represents a real investment, and the buttons may well outlast several coats. The button mould, the wooden form around which the button covering is stretched, is a piece of household equipment as routine as a thimble. Making buttons is domestic work, done in the evening by firelight, and a girl learns to do it as she learns to sew and spin and mend, as part of the unremarkable curriculum of a female childhood. Sunday clothes are a category apart. Boston observes the Sabbath with genuine seriousness, and appearing at meeting in one's best clothes is both an act of reverence and an act of social presentation. The best gown comes out of the chest on Saturday evening, inspected for spots, pressed with the heavy iron heated in the fire. The best cap, which is whiter and crisper than the weekday ones, is tied carefully. The husband's coat is brushed and the boots blacked. The children's faces are washed with extra thoroughness, and their hair is combed into something approaching order. And then the household walks to meeting, the Old South Meeting House, or the Brattle Street Church, or whichever congregation claims this family's loyalty, and takes its place in the pew and observes the Sabbath in the company of its neighbours, each family in its best clothes, each set of faces slightly more composed than usual, each small body squirming in its seat by degrees as the sermon moves through its first hour toward its second. The clothing of the poor and the clothing of the enslaved deserves acknowledgement, because it is part of the picture. The servants who work in Boston households, whether free or enslaved, are often clothed by their employers, and the clothing is functional and minimal. A wool petticoat, a linen shift, a second-hand coat for winter, shoes, if the employer is reasonably humane. The newspaper advertisements for runaway enslaved people describe their clothing in careful detail: the colour of the coat, the condition of the shoes, any distinctive features, because clothing is identifying in a world where photography doesn't exist, and where the clothing is often the property of the person who placed the advertisement rather than the person wearing it. By mid-afternoon, the day's clothing has accumulated its day: a splash of porridge on the sleeve that dried before you noticed it, a streak of ash from the fire on the skirt, the particular softening that happens to heavy wool as it warms to the body and settles into the shape of sitting and bending and reaching. The clothes know the day's work. They carry it in their fibres, and in the evening, when the children have been put to bed and the house is settling into quiet, you take off the outer layers and hang them on their hooks, and stand for a moment in the shift that is the next layer down, and feel the cold of the room against your arms, and feel also the familiar weight of the day going, the body returning to something simpler. The cap comes off last. It is placed on the hook nearest the bed. In the morning it will go back on, along with everything else, and the day will begin again in the same direction, wearing the same body and most of the same clothes, in a life where clothing is not self-expression but simply, and importantly, the management of the weather and the expectations of the world outside the door. If you're drifting off, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you wake up. Sleep well. The children of this house. There are more children in colonial Boston than there are adults, or close to it. A married woman in the early 1700s might expect to bear 7 or 8 children over the course of her childbearing years, and she knows this knowledge is not hidden from her, not romanticised away, that 2 or 3 of them will not survive infancy. Childhood illness is not an abstraction in this city. It is a recurring event, and the grief that follows it is real and particular, and managed within the framework of a religious tradition that has specific things to say about the deaths of children, though those things are not always comforting, and are not always believed with the wholeness that is asked for. Cotton Mather, the Boston minister who fought for smallpox inoculation, buried several of his children. He wrote about their deaths in his diary, with a grief that is unmistakable across 3 centuries. The small bodies, the specific names, the particular light that was in each of them before it went out. Mather was an unusual man in many ways, but in this he was representative. Boston parents in the 1700s loved their children in the full modern sense of the word, with the full weight of that love, in the full knowledge that they might lose them. This knowledge does not make the love more formal or more distant, as a certain strain of historical thinking once suggested. It makes it more urgent. The children who survive infancy are integrated into the household's work from early on, not because the parents are indifferent to childhood, but because the household cannot function otherwise, and because work is understood as education, as the means by which a child becomes a capable adult. A girl of 6 is learning to card wool. By 10 she is spinning. By 12 she can knit, sew, manage a fire, cook simple things, mind a baby. A boy of 6 is running errands. By 10 he may be in a school or in a master's shop as a young apprentice. By 14 he is doing a man's share of the work, whatever that work is. The schools of colonial Boston are a genuine point of pride for the city. The Boston Latin School, founded in 1635, the year before Harvard, is the oldest public school in continuous operation in the Americas, and Bostonians know it and say so frequently. The Latin School educates the boys who will go on to Harvard and then to the ministry or the law or the increasingly important profession of merchant. It teaches Latin and Greek and rhetoric and mathematics, and its graduates are among the best educated men in the English-speaking world outside the universities of England. But most Boston children do not attend the Latin School. The dame schools, small schools run by women, usually from their own keeping rooms teaching reading and basic writing and arithmetic for a modest fee, serve the children of middling households who need literacy but not classical learning. The children sit on benches, reciting their letters from a hornbook, a paddle-shaped board holding a printed page of the alphabet protected by a thin sheet of transparent horn, and practice their sums on slates. The dame who runs the school is often also minding her own household simultaneously, and the atmosphere is domestic rather than institutional, with the fire going and the bread possibly in the oven and a baby in a cradle by the hearth. Not all children in Boston go to school. The children of the very poor may never learn to read, or may learn only enough to recognize their names and a few words of scripture. The children of enslaved people in Boston have no formal access to education, though some learn to read privately, through the generosity of employers or the determination of parents, and this literacy becomes, over time, a quiet form of resistance and sustenance. The diversity of educational experience in colonial Boston is one of the things that its self-congratulatory narrative about public schooling tends to flatten. Children play. Even in a city as serious about work and piety as Boston in the early 1700s, the children find their way to play, because that is what children do, and no amount of theological conviction changes this particular physics. The games they play are the games that children have always played. Chasing games, ball games, games involving sticks and hoops and improvised equipment. In winter, when the ponds north of the city freeze hard enough, boys skate, or rather slide, since ice skates exist but are not universal, and build snow forts and throw snowballs with an aim that improves with practice and is occasionally applied to targets that the targets find much less entertaining than the throwers. The relationship between parents and children is formal by the standards of later centuries. You address your father as Sir, and your mother with a deference that is genuine and not performed, but it is not cold. Boston family life in the early 1700s, when you read the diaries and letters that survive it, has tenderness and humour, and the kind of easy familiarity that comes from people who live in small spaces and share everything and know each other completely. The formality is a surface that organises the relationship without defining it, the way the structure of a meeting house organises the congregation without being what the congregation is for. Illness in children is the recurring shadow of Boston family life. The city's density, 10,000 people on a small peninsula, means that when disease comes, it moves through the population with a speed and thoroughness that isolated rural communities don't experience. The great smallpox epidemic of 1721, which happened just a few years before our particular morning, killed perhaps 200 Bostonians and sickened several thousand more. Before Onesimus and Cotton Mather's controversial inoculation campaign, smallpox killed somewhere between 10 and 15% of those it infected, and in children the mortality was higher. The epidemic of 1721 was not the first and would not be the last. Boston parents knew this. They lived alongside this knowledge the way you live alongside any knowledge that cannot be changed. By not looking at it directly most of the time, and by tending the fire and cooking the dinner and mending the clothes and going about the business of a life that must in the end be lived. The nursing of sick children falls almost entirely to women. The mother, the grandmother if she's nearby, the neighbour women who come in to help. These are the people who sit up through the night with a feverish child, who apply the remedies that experience and tradition prescribe, who pray and watch and do what can be done. The physician may be called if the family can afford it, but the physician's options in the early 1700s are genuinely limited, and the domestic nurses often know as much as he does, having seen more cases of childhood illness across more lifetimes. The minister visits in serious illness. The minister of a colonial Boston congregation is a figure of real authority and real presence, not just on Sundays but throughout the week, in the homes of his parishioners, at deathbeds, at births, in the disputes and crises and domestic difficulties that make up the texture of community life. He brings scripture and prayer and he brings also a kind of gravity that acknowledges the seriousness of what is happening without flinching from it, which is sometimes exactly what is needed. A Boston child who survives childhood and reaches adulthood has absorbed, without quite knowing it, an enormous amount of practical knowledge. She knows how to manage a fire, how to bake bread, how to preserve vegetables, how to manage a household's resources across a winter, how to care for children younger than herself, how to mend and sew and spin. He knows a trade, or the beginning of one, and how to read and reckon, and who his neighbours are, and what the social geography of the city demands. They have both lost at least one sibling, probably, and possibly a parent, and they carry this loss in the way that people carry loss that comes early. Not as a wound, exactly, but as a permanent adjustment to how the world is. Marriage in colonial Boston happens younger than in later centuries, but not as young as the stereotype suggests. A woman typically marries in her early 20s, a man a few years later, and the marriage is not usually arranged in the formal sense. There is courtship, there is a degree of choice, and the consent of the parties is legally required. What the parents and the community contribute is a form of supervision and economic input. The bride's family provides a dowry of household goods. The groom's family or the groom himself provides housing and the beginning of economic establishment. The marriage is a domestic partnership as much as a romantic one, and the success of it depends on qualities: industriousness, steadiness, practical competence, the ability to manage a household under various conditions of difficulty that are not identical with what later centuries will call romantic love, though they are not incompatible with it either. The children born of that marriage are the continuation of everything that matters: the trade, the household, the name, the faith, the small accumulated property of a working life. They are also to their parents themselves. Specific faces and voices and personalities, beloved in their particularity and not only as continuation. The father who sits with his son over the hornbook in the evening, drilling letters with more patience than he might have predicted he had in him, is not only thinking about the future of the family name, he is thinking about this boy and this evening and the particular way this child's mouth shapes itself around the letter A when he finally gets it right. This afternoon, however, none of that is present. The afternoon is just the afternoon. The youngest child is asleep in her cradle by the fire, making the small sounds that sleeping infants make. The sigh, the occasional murmur, the way the breathing changes and deepens. The older children have been set tasks and are performing them with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The boy is practicing his letters with more success than yesterday, though he holds the pen at an angle that will eventually need correcting. The girl has finished her mending and is now engaged in something that looks like idleness, but is actually, if you watch for a moment, the private play of a child who is not quite done being a child yet, composing something quiet and invisible inside herself. The fire burns, the baby breathes, the city outside goes on with its afternoon, and in the keeping room of this ordinary Boston house, the children are learning, by being alive in it, everything that a life in this city requires. Among your neighbours, Boston in the early 1700s is a walking city, which means it is a knowing city. You cannot live here and remain anonymous. The streets are too narrow, the population too dense, the social fabric too tightly woven. Your neighbours know your business, not because they are malicious or intrusive, though some of them are, but because in a city of 10,000 people on a small peninsula, other people's business is simply visible, and the monitoring of it is as natural as breathing. The woman across the lane knows when you have had a bad night, because your candle was burning past 10 o'clock. The man at the end of the street knows your husband came home from the tavern later than usual last Wednesday. The children of the neighbourhood know everything, because children are always watching and never quite invisible. This density of social knowledge is, like most things in Boston's social fabric, both a comfort and a constraint. It means that genuine hardship is difficult to hide, and therefore difficult to suffer alone. When the family on Ship Street lost their father last November, a dockhand fell from a rigging. The neighbourhood knew within hours, and the food began arriving the next morning. A loaf of bread from one household, a pot of soup from another, a pound of salt pork from the woman at the corner who has more than she needs this winter, and remembers what it is to have nothing. This is not charity organised by institutions. It is the spontaneous response of a community that can see need directly and respond to it directly, without any bureaucratic intermediary. The Puritan tradition that shaped Boston created strong expectations of communal responsibility. The early ministers preached, and the congregations largely accepted, that the welfare of the community was a shared concern, that the wealthy had obligations to the poor, and that suffering which could be alleviated and wasn't represented a moral failure on the part of the community, not just a personal misfortune on the part of the sufferer. By the 1700s, this theology has been modified somewhat by the growing influence of commerce and the idea that prosperity is earned and poverty may be deserved. But the communal instinct persists, and it shapes the neighbourhood life of Boston in ways that are not always visible in the official record, but are unmistakable in the diaries and letters and church records that survive. The meetings of the congregational churches are the primary social institution of Boston life, and they are more than religious gatherings. They are town meetings, information exchanges, argument forums, and the primary occasion on which the whole community sees itself whole. The minister's sermon, which can run for 2 hours, and sometimes does, addresses not just scripture, but current events, political questions, the moral state of the community, the particular sins that seem to be in season this week. The congregation listens, and the congregation talks about what it has heard on the way home and over dinner and for days afterward. The minister's voice is one of the most powerful public voices in Boston, not because it has political authority in the formal sense. The congregational tradition is wary of clerical power, but because it shapes the framework within which the community understands itself. The taverns are the other great public institution, and they serve a complementary function, where the meeting house is the place where Boston aspires, where it presents its best self, its most orderly self, the self that is building a city on a hill. The tavern is the place where Boston relaxes. The taverns of early 18th century Boston are not dives, though there are a few establishments at the waterfront that come close to that description. Most are regulated by license, serving food as well as drink, providing accommodation for travellers, and functioning as informal news exchanges in an era when the printed newspaper is only just becoming established. The Boston Newsletter, founded in 1704, is America's first continuously published newspaper, and it is read in taverns as much as in homes. It's a single sheet printed on both sides containing shipping news, London dispatches that are several weeks old by the time they arrive, local court records, and the occasional editorial opinion on a matter of public concern. It costs a penny, which is not nothing, and so it tends to be shared. Read aloud in taverns, passed hand to hand in coffee houses, discussed and argued over in ways that the printer probably finds gratifying and occasionally finds alarming. The coffee houses of Boston, there are several by the early 1700s, are places where merchants and lawyers and ministers and the occasional well-read craftsman gather to drink coffee and argue about everything from the price of molasses to the theology of original sin. The social life of women in colonial Boston is different from the social life of men, and it is less visible in the historical record, but it is not absent. Women visit each other's homes in the afternoons, bringing their sewing or knitting, sitting together by the fire, talking. What they talk about would fill volumes if anyone had systematically recorded it, and occasionally someone did, in a diary or a letter, and what emerges is conversation that covers the same range of human concern as any other. The health of children, the prices of things, the behaviour of husbands, the character of neighbours, the quality of sermons, the state of the relationship between the colony and the crown. Women share the practical knowledge that governs colonial domestic life, the recipe for a particular remedy, the best source for a certain kind of cloth, what the signs mean when a child's fever goes a certain way. The waterfront has a social world of its own, governed by different rules and different rhythms than the congregational neighbourhoods further from the harbour. The sailors who pass through Boston on the coastal and Atlantic trade are visitors to the city rather than members of it, and they inhabit it accordingly. In the waterfront taverns and boarding houses, in the streets nearest the wharves, in the particular floating world that port cities always generate. They bring news from other ports, which is valuable, and goods for sale, which is sometimes welcome and sometimes not. The customs officers have opinions about this. They also bring diseases, occasionally which is less welcome, and the smallpox epidemic of 1721 was blamed by many Bostonians on ships from the Caribbean, an attribution that may or may not have been accurate. The market days, held twice a week in the market square near the townhouse, are the great social equalizer of Boston's street life. Everyone goes to market, the merchant's wife and the washerwoman, the minister's housekeeper and the dockhand's wife. The free black residents, who have their own market stalls and their own networks of trade. The market sells fresh fish from the harbour boats, vegetables from the gardens of Roxbury and Cambridge, meat from the butchers whose stalls have permanent locations in the market shed, eggs and butter and cheese from the farms of the surrounding countryside, and the 100 small domestic goods, pins, thread, ribbon, small tools, that people need and cannot always afford to buy in a shop. Here is where you hear what is happening in Boston if you want to know. The market is where news travels at the speed of conversation. Who has died? Whose ship has come in? Which merchant has gone bankrupt? What the governor said at the council meeting? What was found washed up on the long wharf this morning? The people who move through it are the living nervous system of the city, transmitting information in all directions simultaneously, processing it through the 1,000 filters of relationship and interest and prior knowledge that turn raw information into meaning. Music is present in Boston, though it requires a word of explanation. The Puritan tradition was deeply suspicious of instrumental music in church. The organ was popish, the fiddle was associated with dancing, which was associated with vice, and the lute had unfortunate connotations of idleness and desire. But the tradition was not hostile to the human voice, and the congregational singing of psalm, from the Bay Psalm book published in Cambridge in 1640 and still in use, was a genuine and collective musical experience, however austere. Outside the meeting house, music was freer. Fiddles at taverns, ballads sung on the street and at hearthside, the work songs of the dock hands, the lullabies that mothers sang over cradles in a dozen rooms in every street. By the time the afternoon is well advanced, the quality of Boston's street life has changed slightly. The morning's purposefulness has given way to something looser. The market is packing up. The craftsmen's shops are finishing the day's work. The taverns are beginning to fill with the men who have finished for the day and are not quite ready to go home, sitting over their pewter mugs of beer or cider, or the flip that the tapster makes with the hot poker. The conversation at these tables is loud enough to spill into the street. Laughter, argument, the particular social music of men relaxing in each other's company after a day of work. In the street, children are playing in the last of the light. They know this light, know how to read its quality, know that it means the evening is coming, and with it supper and then bed, and they are extracting from it what remains. A hoop rolls down the lane and a boy runs after it. 2 girls are jumping rope in the yard of the house at the corner, counting in English, and occasionally in a language that sounds like something older. A counting song that one of them learned from a grandmother, who learned it from someone else, its origin now unrecoverable. The lamps in the windows of the houses are beginning to show. Not many, not yet, not in the early evening, but a few in the rooms where someone is working late or where the evening meal is being set. The light of them is warm and yellowish and small, each window a separate small fire behind its glass, and together they give the street a particular quality, not bright, not dark, but inhabited. This is what a city looks like from inside it in the early evening of the early 1700s, a collection of inhabited windows, each one holding a separate life, pressed close enough together that the warmth of one can almost reach the warmth of the next. The body and its remedies. If you live in colonial Boston, your body is a project that requires constant management. This is not a neurotic preoccupation, it is a practical reality. The diseases that kill people in the early 1700s are not abstract threats. They are your neighbours' deaths, your children's close calls, the recurring episodes of fever and cough and flux that punctuate the ordinary calendar of a life in a dense, imperfectly sanitated port city. You're not fatalistic about your health exactly, but you're realistic about it in a way that later centuries, armed with antibiotics and vaccines and clean water systems, find difficult to inhabit imaginatively. The medical understanding of the early 1700s is not the superstitious nonsense that later popular history often makes it. The physicians of colonial Boston are educated men, several have trained in Edinburgh or London, who are working within a coherent theoretical framework that has serious shortcomings, but is not irrational. The framework is roughly Galenic. The body is understood as a system of humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, that must be kept in balance, and disease is understood as an imbalance that must be corrected through therapeutic intervention. The interventions available include bleeding, removing blood to reduce an excess, purging, using emetics or cathartics to clear the digestive system, sweating, inducing perspiration to drive out bad humours, and the administration of various herbal and mineral preparations, whose effects range from genuinely helpful to genuinely harmful. Bloodletting, the opening of a vein to release a quantity of blood, is still in common use in the early 1700s, though it is beginning to attract skepticism from some quarters. The theoretical basis for it is that an excess of blood causes inflammation and fever, and removing some of the blood reduces the excess. In some conditions, there may be a marginal truth to this. In many others, removing blood from a patient who is already weakened by disease makes things considerably worse. The colonial physician does not always know this, or does not always act on knowing it, because the therapeutic tradition is powerful, and the clinical evidence for its failure is diffuse and hard to interpret without the statistical tools that a later era will develop. What ordinary Boston people do when they are sick is, more often than not, manage it at home. The physician is expensive, and his visit requires a payment that a craftsman's household cannot always manage. The domestic medical tradition, the remedies kept in the kitchen cabinet, the knowledge passed from mother to daughter across generations, the advice of the neighbours who have seen this before, handles the majority of illness in the city. This tradition is not ineffective. Many of the herbal remedies in common use have genuine pharmacological activity. Willow bark, which contains salicylic acid and reduces fever, chamomile, which has mild anti-inflammatory properties, ginger, which settles the stomach, and many others whose mechanisms were unknown but whose effects were real. The smallpox controversy of 1721 is the most dramatic episode in early Boston medical history, and it is worth understanding in full because it reveals something essential about the city. Smallpox arrived with a ship from the Caribbean in April of 1721. By May it was spreading through the population. By summer it was an epidemic, and the minister Cotton Mather, who had heard from his enslaved servant Onesimus about an African practice of variolation, and had read about similar practices in the proceedings of the Royal Society of London, proposed that the population be inoculated. The procedure involved taking matter from the pustule of a mild smallpox case and introducing it into a small cut in the arm of a healthy person, inducing a controlled, usually mild infection that conferred immunity. The physicians of Boston were mostly horrified. The idea violated their understanding of disease, which was that you treated illness, not introduced it deliberately into healthy people. The public was frightened. The newspaper, the Boston Courant, published furious opposition. Someone threw an incendiary device through Mather's window. Only one physician in Boston, Zabdiel Boylston, agreed to perform the inoculations, and he did so under public pressure and at personal risk. The results were unambiguous. Of the roughly 280 people Boylston inoculated, 6 died, a mortality of about 2%. Of the thousands who contracted smallpox naturally during the epidemic, nearly 15% died. The inoculation worked. Boston's medical establishment was wrong, and the knowledge of an enslaved African man, transmitted through a minister and a brave physician, was right. This episode echoes through Boston's medical and social history in complicated ways, and the complication is worth sitting with. The knowledge that saved hundreds of lives came from Africa, via the memory of a man whose name was Onesimus, who had been brought to Boston against his will and given to Cotton Mather as a gift, and who remembered what his home community did when smallpox came. Mather credited him, in private correspondence and in a pamphlet he wrote about the inoculation debate, more clearly than his successors would. The official medical history of the episode tends to feature Boylston and Mather, and to treat the African origin of the practice as a footnote. It was not a footnote, it was the whole of the thing. For the ordinary Boston household, medicine is a domestic practice, interrupted occasionally by professional consultation. The medicine cabinet, a shelf in the kitchen usually, or a small chest, holds a collection of dried herbs and prepared remedies that the woman of the house has assembled over time from her own knowledge, from family recipes, from the advice of neighbours and midwives, and occasionally from the almanacs that offer medical advice along with weather predictions and useful agricultural information. There is dried chamomile for stomach complaints. There is horehound candy for coughs. There is a preparation of boneset, a native plant learned from indigenous neighbours, for fever. There is vinegar, which is useful for many things, including treating the skin after exposure to cold. There is opium, if the household is prosperous enough to obtain it, for pain. The midwife is the figure who attends births, and in colonial Boston births are frequent. A woman gives birth in her own bed, attended by the midwife and by female neighbours and relatives who provide support and practical assistance. The physician is not normally present at a birth. Midwifery is the province of women, and the male physician who intrudes into this space does so at the cost of some social friction. The midwife brings her experience of hundreds of births, her knowledge of what is normal and what is not, and her collection of remedies for the various complications that childbirth produces. She is not always successful. Maternal mortality in colonial Boston is real, and certain complications that later medicine will manage with surgery or drugs are simply fatal in this era. But she's usually the most qualified person in the room, and often the most effective. Mental illness in colonial Boston is managed largely through the same channels as physical illness: domestic care, neighbourhood support, ministerial attention. The understanding of mental illness is that it is either a spiritual crisis, amenable to prayer and pastoral intervention, or a physical imbalance of the humours, amenable to the same treatments as physical disease. The vocabulary for describing mental illness is limited. A person may be melancholic, or distracted, or raving, and these conditions are treated as distinct states requiring different responses. The profoundly ill, those who cannot care for themselves, who pose a danger, who have become wholly disconnected from ordinary functioning, may end up in the almshouse, which provides a minimal level of care and containment but little else. Teeth are a particular problem. The dentistry of colonial Boston is extractive in both senses. If a tooth is causing trouble, it is usually pulled. The instruments for this are not always appropriate to the task, and the person performing the extraction is not always a trained professional. A barber surgeon may do the job, or a blacksmith with the right kind of pliers, or the town's physician if the pain is severe enough to justify his fee. The alternatives, leaving the tooth, treating the pain with cloves or brandy or laudanum, are sometimes chosen when the prospect of extraction is too alarming. The result over time is a general state of dental health that later centuries would find distressing, visible in portraits of the era where the set of the mouth sometimes reveals what the painter diplomatically did not depict. The regulation of the body's rhythms, sleep, waking, eating, working, is understood differently in the early 1700s than it will be in the era of artificial light and the 8-hour day. The colonial body follows the sun more directly, rising near dawn, working in the light, eating the main meal in the middle of the day when the body's energy is highest, and retiring early in winter when the cost of artificial light makes staying up genuinely expensive. The midwinter dark arrives before 5 in the afternoon, and by 9 or 10 in the evening most households are in bed. This produces a different relationship with sleep than modern people have. Longer, more fragmented. It was common to wake in the middle of the night for an hour or two of light activity, reading or prayer or quiet conversation, before returning to sleep until dawn, and more closely tied to the seasonal variation in daylight. The water that Boston drinks is a matter of ongoing concern, because the wells of the peninsula are not always reliable. The city's growing population has put pressure on the local water supply, and the wells in the more densely settled neighbourhoods, particularly near the wharves, where privies and waste have been accumulating for 70 years, are sometimes of doubtful quality. The connection between contaminated water and disease is not understood in germ theory terms. That understanding will not come for another century and a half, but it is empirically observed. People who drink from certain wells are more likely to be ill than those who drink from others, and this observation shapes behaviour even without a theoretical framework to explain it. The preference for cider and beer over water is not simply colonial taste for alcohol. It is a practical response to the fact that the fermentation process kills the pathogens that contaminated water carries. But the body is also a source of pleasure, and colonial Boston is not Puritan in the caricature sense of being hostile to bodily experience. People eat well when they can. They enjoy warmth, the good humour of a tavern company over a well-made flip, the pleasure of a walk along the waterfront on a good spring day, the particular satisfaction of a body that has worked hard and is now resting. These things are real and acknowledged. The theology that shaped the city may have been suspicious of sensual excess, but it was not hostile to the honest pleasures of a creature in a body, living a life that God had given it. The evening brings with it a heightened awareness of the body. The day's work has been felt in the muscles. The cold that seeped in from the street during the afternoon's errands has settled in the joints. The eyes are tired from the afternoon's sewing in the failing light. You sit closer to the fire now, and the warmth of it reaches through the wool of your clothes to the skin beneath, and the tiredness of the body and the warmth of the fire is one of the deepest pleasures of the day, the particular sweetness of a body that has done what was required of it, and is now, at last, being allowed to be still. The price of things. Money in colonial Boston is a more complicated subject than you might expect, because the money is itself complicated. The official currency is English, pounds, shillings, pence, but English coin is scarce in the colonies, because trade runs in one direction and payment in another, and the mechanisms of international finance have not yet evolved to compensate for this. What fills the gap is a mixture of Spanish pieces of 8 from the Caribbean trade, bits of coin from a dozen other nations passing through the port, promissory notes, barter, credit, and, most contentiously, the paper money that the Massachusetts Bay Colony has been printing since 1690. The paper money is called bills of credit, and Bostonians have complicated feelings about it. On the one hand, it fills a genuine need. Without some medium of exchange, commerce becomes difficult in ways that cost everyone. On the other hand, paper money without a reliable gold or silver backing tends to lose value over time, and it has, and the merchants who hold it and find it worth less than its face value by the time they go to spend it are not philosophical about this. The debate over currency and what should back it, how much should be issued, who should control it, is one of the great political arguments of early 18th century Boston, generating pamphlets and committee meetings and considerable heat. The practical effect of the currency situation on an ordinary Boston household is that credit is more common than cash, and relationships matter more than money in the formal sense. The craftsman who buys his materials from the merchant does so on credit, the debt recorded in the merchant's account book, to be settled when the craftsman sells his goods and the merchant's share comes back around. The woman who buys fabric from the draper does so with a line of credit that extends from her husband's account. The whole economy of the city runs on an elaborate system of mutual obligation, whose ultimate settlement in actual coin may take months or years, and may sometimes never quite happen. What things cost in colonial Boston, in terms that make sense across the centuries, is difficult to calculate precisely, but some specific prices give a sense of scale. A good craftsman's daily wage is somewhere between 2 and 4 shillings, depending on the trade and the season. A pound of butter at the market costs perhaps 4 pence. A loaf of bread, roughly a penny. A pair of shoes, made to order by a competent cordwainer, perhaps 5 or 6 shillings, so a day and a half's work, which is not cheap. A cord of firewood, in a normal winter, perhaps 15 to 20 shillings, so 5 or 6 days' wages. A Bible, which is a necessary household possession, costs several shillings and represents a significant purchase. The fees for a physician's visit, if the illness is serious, might cost a day's wages and strain the household budget. The market at the townhouse runs on Tuesday and Friday mornings, and the rhythms of a household's purchasing follow it. You don't shop every day, partly because the market doesn't operate every day, and partly because preserving and storing food is a more efficient use of resources than buying it fresh in small quantities. On market day, you go early. The best fish and the freshest butter go first, with a basket and a specific list of what the household needs this week, and a rough calculation of what you have available to spend. The list and the calculation are usually in your head, carried there by a kind of domestic accounting that happens continuously, without paper, tracking what's in the cellar against what's needed and what's available against what it costs. The negotiation of price at the market is active and normal. Fixed prices exist in shops, where the proprietor sets the price, and the customer accepts or goes elsewhere. The market is different. Vendors expect to negotiate, and a woman who pays the first price asked for anything is considered to have overpaid. The negotiation is conducted with a certain formality that is almost theatrical. The expression of doubt about the quality of the goods, the counteroffer delivered with an air of mild regret, the final agreement reached with mutual expressions of satisfaction that both parties may or may not feel. It is a transaction, but it is also a social exchange, and the woman who has been coming to this market stall for 10 years has a relationship with its operator that includes the memory of past transactions, the knowledge of family circumstances on both sides, and a mutual investment in the relationship continuing. The merchants at the top of Boston's commercial life live differently from the craftsmen and market women below them, but not extravagantly differently by later standards. Their houses are larger and their furnishings better, but the house is still heated by fire and lit by candle and served by a limited number of people. What distinguishes a merchant's household is the quality of the materials, the silver candlesticks rather than pewter, the imported mahogany furniture rather than local pine, the silk damask on the best chairs rather than wool serge. And the food at table reflects the merchant's access to the goods that flow through the port. The West Indian sugar used freely rather than sparingly, the imported wine rather than the local cider, the spices, nutmeg, pepper, cinnamon, used with a generosity that a craftsman's household cannot afford. The merchant's wife manages a household economy of real complexity. She oversees the servants, manages the provisions, handles the domestic accounts that record what comes in and goes out of the kitchen, and maintains the social relationships that are part of a merchant family's commercial infrastructure. Wives of successful merchants in colonial Boston are not idle women. They are managers of small enterprises, and their competence, or its absence, is directly legible in the condition of the household. The letters and diaries of merchant wives reveal women who track prices, manage credit, conduct transactions in their husband's absence, and hold opinions about commerce that are not always unsophisticated. Debt is the texture of colonial economic life. Almost everyone owes someone, and almost everyone is owed by someone, and the management of these relationships, knowing when to press for payment and when to extend patience, knowing whose credit is good and whose is about to fail, is a significant skill. The courts of Boston spend considerable time on debt collection cases, which suggests that the informal management of credit doesn't always work. A man who cannot pay his debts can be taken to court, his goods attached by the constable, his business disrupted in ways that compound the original problem. Debtor's prison exists in theory, though it is more commonly avoided through the negotiation of new terms than through actual imprisonment. The terror of debt, of the loss of everything that a life of work has built, is one of the persistent anxieties of colonial Boston life. The rum trade deserves its own paragraph, because it is woven into the economy of Boston so thoroughly that you cannot understand the city without it. Boston distilleries turned Caribbean molasses into rum at a prodigious rate. By the early 1700s, there are dozens of distilleries operating in and around the city. The rum goes into the Atlantic trade, to West Africa, where it is exchanged for enslaved people, to the Caribbean, where it is sold for molasses, to the colonial markets, where it is consumed. The slavery embedded in this triangle is not invisible to Bostonians. There are enslaved people in the city, visible on every street, but it is not consistently acknowledged either, and the ministers who can find a theological argument against a great many things do not always find arguments against this. The harbour is where the money ultimately comes from and goes to. Standing at the end of Long Wharf on a busy spring morning, watching the ships being loaded and unloaded, hearing the creak of the hoisting gear and the shouts of the supervisors, and the groan of the winches, you can feel the metabolism of the city running through the water and the wood and the barrels. This is what sustains everything else. The craftsman's workshops, the minister's salary, the school on the corner, the bread in the bakehouse. The harbour is not a scenic backdrop. It is the reason Boston exists, and the sound of it, tidal, rhythmic, ancient, underlies everything else that the city does. By late afternoon, the commerce of the day is winding toward completion. The market has closed. The merchants' clerks are tallying the day's transactions in the account books, the columns of figures adding and subtracting in the cramped, clear handwriting of men who do this for a living. The craftsmen are finishing the last work of the day before the light fails completely. The taverns are beginning the steady accumulation of custom that will peak in the early evening and then thin out as men drift home for supper. The city's economy does not stop at night. The harbour never fully stops. Somewhere in the dark, a night watchman walks his rounds, calling the hours into the cold air of the streets, listening for the sound of fire or trouble. The ships at the wharves creak and settle. The tide moves in and out regardless of the darkness, regardless of who is watching. The money in the account books does its invisible work of recording and obligation, waiting for morning to become active again. But in the households, the economic life of the day has paused. The money that came in is put away, in the cash box, in the drawer of the high desk, in the linen pocket tied around the waist under the skirt, which is how money is safely carried in a city where pockets are accessible to nimble fingers. The debts of the day have been noted. The calculations of what was spent and what remains have been done silently, in the particular mental ledger that every household keeps. It is enough, or close enough, or will have to be. Tomorrow there will be more of the same. More market, more labour, more bread and salt pork and molasses, and the accounting will begin again. What the bells are saying, you cannot live in Boston in the early 1700s without being in regular conversation with God, or at least with the institutional expressions of that conversation. The churches are not background furniture. They are the primary social and intellectual institutions of the city, and their ministers are among the most powerful figures in Boston's public life, not through formal political authority, which the congregational tradition is careful to keep separate from the clergy, but through the persuasive force of regular oratory, delivered to a captive audience twice a week for decades. A Boston minister who preaches well, who has a gift for making theology feel urgent and personal and connected to the actual conditions of his congregation's lives, can shape the moral imagination of a neighbourhood in ways that persist for generations. The meeting house where you worship is simple by design. The Puritan founders of the colony were deeply suspicious of elaborate church architecture, which they associated with Catholicism and the Anglican Church they had fled, and the New England meeting houses of the early 1700s reflect this. No stained glass, no carved altarpiece, no decorative programs of any kind. The interior is plain white plaster and natural wood, with box pews arranged around a central pulpit that is raised high enough that the minister looks down at his congregation from a significant elevation. The effect is less theatrical than it sounds. The Puritan aesthetic has its own austere beauty, the beauty of things stripped to their purpose. But it is unambiguous about where the authority in the room resides. Sunday is a complete cessation of ordinary life. This is not a suggestion or a preference. It is the law of the colony, and it is enforced by social pressure as much as by the constable. You do not work on Sunday, you do not travel unnecessarily, you do not engage in recreation, and you attend meeting in the morning and often in the afternoon as well. Children who are caught playing on Sunday in the street may be brought before the selectmen. Shopkeepers who open on Sunday risk their license. The Sabbath is observed in colonial Boston with a seriousness that later generations will find extraordinary. But the Sabbath is also, in its way, a rest. The cessation of ordinary labour that it enforces is experienced by most people as at least partially welcome, because the ordinary labour is hard and the cessation is real. The meeting house is warm, warmer than most private houses on a Sunday morning in winter, because the fire has been going since early, and the body heat of several hundred people makes a significant contribution, and the sermon, whatever its content, produces an experience of communal attention that is rare in ordinary life. You're sitting with your neighbours, all of you oriented toward the same voice, all of you occupying the same mental space for the duration of the sermon. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, one of the things that keeps a community a community. The theology that the ministers preach is genuinely demanding. Calvinism, the theological tradition that shaped New England Puritanism, holds that human beings are fundamentally corrupted by original sin, that they are incapable of saving themselves through good works or righteous behaviour, and that salvation is entirely the gift of God, given to those whom God has elected for it and withheld from those he has not. This is a theology that provides no easy comfort. You cannot earn your way into heaven. You cannot know with certainty that you are among the elect. What you can do is live in the constant awareness of your own insufficiency and God's absolute sovereignty, and trust that the grace that may or may not be given will, if it is given, reveal itself in ways you will recognize. The practical effect of this theology on daily life is more interesting than its formal statement suggests. It creates a particular kind of moral seriousness, not the morality of rules followed for reward, but the morality of a person who understands herself to be under constant divine observation and whose actions have significance because of that observation, not because of the social consequences they may produce. This is different from simply doing good because you fear punishment. It is more like being unable to stop caring about the quality of your inner life, even in private, even when no one is watching, because someone always is. The ministers of Boston are also, in the early 1700s, among its most educated and intellectually active citizens. Cotton Mather, whatever one thinks of his theology and his role in the Salem witch trials of 1692, was a man of genuine learning who corresponded with the Royal Society of London, wrote several hundred books and pamphlets on subjects ranging from science to history to theology to domestic life, and was in active conversation with the best intellectual minds of his era. His relationship to science, the Inoculation controversy reveals this most clearly, was complicated, but it was not hostile. He believed that understanding the natural world was a way of understanding God's creation, and he took seriously the evidence of his senses and the testimony of people who had seen things he had not. The civic institutions of Boston, the town meeting, the selectmen, the various committees and offices that manage the practical affairs of the city, are closely intertwined with its religious institutions, but they are not identical with them. The town meeting is the governing body of Boston in the most immediate sense. It meets regularly, is open to all free male inhabitants who meet the property qualification, and makes the decisions that govern the actual daily life of the city. The maintenance of the streets, the regulation of the market, the licensing of trades, the relief of the poor. The selectmen are the executive committee elected by the town meeting to manage its decisions between meetings. This system is not a democracy in the modern sense. Women do not vote. Enslaved people do not vote. The property qualification excludes the poorest men. Indigenous people are not participants. But within its limits, it functions, and it functions with a degree of popular engagement that was unusual in the 18th century world. Boston citizens argue about public affairs, they hold their representatives accountable, they show up to meetings and make their views known. The tradition of civic participation that will eventually fuel the American Revolution is being formed in these meetings, in these arguments, in this accumulated habit of expecting the government to be answerable to the governed. The question of the relationship between Boston and the Crown is perpetually alive in the early 1700s. The colony's original charter, which gave Massachusetts Bay an unusual degree of self-governance, was revoked by King James II in 1685 and replaced with the Dominion of New England, a centralising scheme that Bostonians despised and eventually overthrew in a local revolution timed to coincide with the Glorious Revolution in England. The new charter of 1691 restored some self-governance, but not all of it. The governor is now appointed by the Crown, not elected by the colonists, and this is a source of continuing tension. Boston is not in rebellion, not yet, not for another 70 years, but it is watchful and resistant in the particular way of people who have a strong sense of what they are owed and a history of defending it. The legal system operates through courts that hear cases in the townhouse on the corner of King Street, a handsome building that serves as both the seat of government and the centre of commercial life, with the merchants' exchange on the ground floor and the courts and council chamber above. Justice is administered by men appointed by the governor, which means by men who owe their positions to the Crown, which means that the tension between royal authority and local custom is felt in the courtroom as surely as it is felt in the town meeting. The cases that come before the courts are mostly the ordinary stuff of urban life: debt, assault, theft, property disputes, the occasional more serious matter. The punishments are public, the stocks, the pillory, whipping, hanging in extreme cases, because public punishment is understood as having a social function, a deterrent and a community statement about what is and is not acceptable. The church bells mark the hours of the day and the events of the calendar. In the morning they ring for service. They ring for the deaths of prominent citizens, one stroke for each year of the deceased life, so that a long life produces a very long tolling, and anyone in earshot can do the arithmetic. They ring for fires and for the approach of ships, and for the occasions that Boston has decided merit public announcement. Living in Boston means living inside the sound of bells, and the bells are understood not as noise but as communication, a continuous signal that the city is alive and attending to its affairs and ready to be told when something important has changed. As the afternoon settles into evening and the last of the winter light flattens against the rooftops, the bells of the Old South Meeting House ring the close of the working day, 6 strokes slow and clear, carrying across the city's narrow streets and over the rooftops and out toward the harbour. You hear them from wherever you are, in the kitchen or the shop or the street, and feel the particular organisation of the day's end that they produce. Not an alarm, not an urgency, but a permission. The permission to stop, to gather, to move toward the evening that is already here. The city closes around itself, not completely. The harbour as always continues. But the shops are shuttering, the workshops going quiet, the market stalls long folded. The taverns are filling, which is its own kind of gathering. And in the houses the fires are being stoked for the evening, the candles lit, the families drawing together in the keeping room for the meal and the conversation, and the brief communal time before bed that is the day's last gift. The evening comes, in supper is the lighter meal, and it is eaten in the early evening, while there is still enough light to see by without wasting candles on the table. The remains of the dinner pot, reheated and perhaps supplemented with bread and cheese and something sweet, the last of the preserved quinces, eaten slowly from a small pewter dish, make up the meal, and it is eaten with less ceremony than dinner, more quietly, with the appetite of people who have worked all day and are beginning to feel the approach of rest. The children eat quickly, the way tired children do, without the small arguments and negotiations of the noon meal. The youngest falls asleep in her chair, her head tilting slowly to the side, caught and righted and tilting again, until you lift her and carry her upstairs to the bed she shares with her sister, the wool blankets pulled up to her chin, her breath slowing in the cold air of the upper room. The older children follow in their turn, quieter than they were an hour ago, the edge of the day's energy spent. The house empties of its daytime sounds. The fire speaks, but the children do not. From the street, the voices of the last foot traffic of the evening drift in. A man calling goodnight across the lane, a cart making its final passage over the cobblestones, the distant sound of music from the tavern 3 streets over. Fiddle and voices blurring together until they are simply one warm sound in the cold dark. You sit by the fire a little longer. Your husband or wife is across the room, reading or mending by the candle, not talking particularly. The silence between you is comfortable. It is the silence of people who have spent a day in the same life and do not need to recount it to each other. The fire has settled to its evening state, not the working fire of the morning and the afternoon, but a quieter thing. The coals glowing red-orange under a light blanket of grey ash, giving warmth without much flame. You add a small piece of wood, not to build the fire back up, but to keep it from going entirely cold before you bank it for the night. The wood catches slowly with a small crackle, and the room brightens briefly and then subsides. There are tasks to finish. There are always tasks to finish, but they are not urgent tasks. The spinning that didn't get done this afternoon can wait for tomorrow. The letter that needs writing can be attempted in the morning when the mind is fresher. The mending that remains can be picked up again when the light is better. You let the tasks go one by one, with the particular permission that the evening grants, the permission to be done for now, to let what wasn't finished be unfinished until tomorrow. Outside, the night watchman has begun his rounds. You can hear him, or rather you can hear his absence and his presence alternately as his footsteps move down the street and around the corner and away, and then back again on the return. He calls the hour, 8 o'clock and clear, his voice carrying in the cold air, and then 9 o'clock and cloudy, and each call is a small reassurance, a signal that someone is awake and watching, that the night is being attended to. Boston at night is not a safe city. There are thieves, there are fires, there are the accidents that darkness produces, but it is a watched city, and the watchman's voice is the sound of that watching. The harbour is audible in the night silence. In the city's daytime noise you don't always register it, but now, with the workshops quiet and the market closed and the street traffic thin to nothing, you can hear the water, the slow slap and suck of the tide against the wharves, the creak of a ship's timber settling. Somewhere far out on the water, too far to see, a vessel is moving through the harbour mouth, and you can hear, or imagine you hear, the sound of its hull displacing the dark water. The harbour breathes. The city breathes with it. The fire is banked. This is the last domestic act of the evening. You arrange the coals in a heap, cover them with a layer of ash from the edges of the hearth, and set the heavy iron fire cover in front of them to protect the floor from any stray spark in the night. Done properly, the banked fire will hold coals until morning, ready to be coaxed back with the first tending of the day. You have done this hundreds of times. Your hands know the shape of the shovel and the weight of the ash and the placement of the cover, without any conscious instruction from the mind. The body remembers. The body always remembers. Upstairs, the bedroom is cold in a way that the keeping room is not. The fire's heat does not reach this far, and the room holds the cold of the day in its walls. You undress quickly, the way you dressed this morning, efficiently without ceremony, the outer garments on their hooks, the cap on its pin, the shoes set together by the door, the shift or the nightcap, whichever modesty and warmth require. And then the bed, the familiar weight of the wool blankets, the feather mattress that holds the shape of where you sleep, and the warmth of the person beside you, already there, already asleep or close to it. The curtains around the bed close. Inside them, the small contained world of the bedstead is a degree or two warmer than the room outside, and in the warmth you feel the day releasing its hold on your body. The muscles unclenching, the tiredness that was everywhere becoming something softer, less like fatigue and more like rest. The pillow is cool against your cheek and then gradually warm. The sound of breathing beside you and above you from the children's room is regular and slow. The house settles into its night sounds, the creak of a beam, the faint moan of the chimney in the wind, the tick of the cooling hearthstone. Sleep, Boston. The city is quiet now, not silent. Boston is never quite silent, even in the deep of night, because the harbour breathes, and the watchman walks, and the fire in 10,000 hearths holds its coals against the morning. But quiet. The particular quiet of a city that has done its day's work and let it go. You are in the bed. The curtains are drawn. The weight of the blankets is the same weight as every night, familiar as your own breathing. The room is cool at the edges and warm at the centre where you are. The darkness behind your closed eyes is complete. Somewhere below, the coals breathe under their cover of ash. They are holding. They are keeping the small warmth that will be the beginning of tomorrow. You do not need to tend them now. They are attended. The night is attended. You can be still. The harbour moves in the dark. Slow, tidal, enormous. The water against the wharf pilings, the creak of rope, the sound of a city that has built itself on the edge of the sea and learned to sleep to the sound of it. You have always known this sound. It is the sound underneath all the other sounds of your life here, the ground note that everything else plays over. The day is behind you now. The fire and the bread and the pot and the children and the work of your hands and the price of things and the sound of the bells and the neighbours' smoke rising and all of it. It is done. It will be there again tomorrow, and tomorrow you will do it again, and that is fine. That is the shape of a life in this city. But that is tomorrow. Tonight the bed holds you. The darkness holds you. The curtains are closed and the coals are banked, and the watchman walks his rounds and calls the hours into the cold air of the streets, and each hour he calls is an hour that has passed without alarm, and that is a gift, and you receive it. Let the harbour sound move through you now, slow and tidal. Let the city go dark street by street. Let the candles in the windows go out one by one. Let the sound of Boston at night become the sound of something quieter than Boston, the sound of water and cold air and the breathing of people asleep. Let the cold at the edges of the room be where it is. It will not reach you. The warmth you have made is your own, and it holds. You're in the bed. You're in the dark. The day is over. The city is quiet. Sleep now. The morning will come when it comes, and the fire will want tending, and the harbour will be busy, and the bread will need to be baked, and the children will come downstairs with sleep still in their faces. But that is morning, and morning is a long way off. The night is wide and dark, and the coals are holding, and the watchman's voice comes from somewhere farther away now, calling into the quiet. All clear, all well, sleep. If you're drifting off, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you wake up. Sleep well. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.